Hey, welcome back to Life on the Wrist. Hope you're doing well. So when you hear the word crisis, you probably don't think of something that is good. It's obviously a bad situation to be in. If you're in a crisis, there's nothing that really good that can come from it. But today we're going to talk about why I believe the Quartz Crisis was a good thing for the watch industry. But before we get into that, as always, if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and like this video. Let's see how many likes we can get on this video. It really would help us out. So the Quartz Crisis, if you are not familiar with it, was a crisis within the watch industry between the 1970s and early 1980s. What ended up happening was the quartz watch movement. The quartz watches that were powered on quartz watch movements took over the watch industry that was mostly made up of mechanical watches. It was made up of mechanical watches, and quartz watches ended up outselling them and were used way more than mechanical watches were used during that time period. This was part of the digital revolution that occurred in the beginning in the 1950s, where things became a lot more digital, which obviously has grown into us using iPhones and computers and all that kind of stuff, and now foldable phones, which is pretty awesome. If you don't know, the world's first quartz watch actually came from Seiko. It was the Seiko Astron in 1969, and because of this massive leap in technology, these quartz watches ended up being a lot more accurate. They were digital, so they're easier to read, and they were lower cost of production, which meant lower cost. It was a lot cheaper to buy quartz watches. So what ended up happening was the Swiss watch industry, which was comprised of approximately 1,600 watchmakers, ended up shrinking to about 600, which is insane. That's taking out 1,000 watchmakers is a substantial amount, and really shows the crisis that occurred when quartz watches ended up taking over the industry. Two giants, these are two watch companies that were formed within Switzerland. Two watch organizations were formed in Switzerland back probably in the early 1900s. The one was the Société Générale de l'Horlogerie Suisse, and the second was Société Suisse pour l'Industrie Horlogerie. Those two giants, these are the two organizations that basically continued to press the watch industry forward. These two giants had to merge because of the Quartz Crisis, and these two watch companies ended up becoming the Swatch Group. They were kind of the predecessors of the Swatch Group, which allowed for the Quartz Crisis to be shunned by watch companies and ended up reviving the Swiss watch industry, namely in mechanical watches. But we're going to do a completely new video on explaining the entire evolution of the Quartz Crisis, because I think it's a very fascinating time period. So like I said in the beginning of the video, a crisis is never really associated with good things that come out of it. A lot of the times, it ends up in really bad situations. But I think what ended up happening was there were a lot of great things that came out of the Swiss watch, the Quartz Crisis. Like any contraction within a market, when the amount of companies start to shrink, it gets rid of poor quality within the watch industry. I'm not saying the watchmakers that ended up having to close because of this Quartz Crisis were making poor quality watches. I'm sure a lot of them were making extremely high quality watches. They just didn't have the funds and were not making sales to drive their businesses forward. But there are some watch companies that probably they probably got rid of a lot of companies that were kind of just producing watches at poor quality. Also, it got rid of unsustainable business practices, which is, for us, it's a good thing because it allows us to streamline the production of these watches, which kind of focuses the pricing of the watches to be a little bit more accurate. It also allowed for the industry to shrink to what was really important to consumers at the time. This allowed us to understand, it allowed watch companies to understand what consumers really value within watches, but it also allowed consumers to understand that perhaps you don't need all these things in these watches, you just need what I really want. But the biggest thing that came out of it was innovation. there are some really amazing watches that came out of the 70s because they were trying to innovate and come up with these crazy ideas that perhaps would catch the attention of the consumer. For example, my memo sale came from the 1970s. It's a very oddball shape, doesn't really look like a normal watch, at least for today's standards. But I think that shows how cool it looks and what can come out of the 70s when you are kind of pressed by some other external force that's saying you need to change, you need to adapt or die, basically. So I think the innovation that comes out of the 70s, I'll put up some pictures of watches from the 70s that are really, really cool. There's a really cool reference from Patek Philippe that looks nothing like a Patek Philippe, but from the 70s, it is a Patek Philippe because they had to try and innovate in some way. So innovation is what really came out of the Quartz Crisis, and I think that's something you should value. I think also that what came out of there is mechanical watches from the 70s are extremely unique and not something that you're going to see every day, which is a really cool watch to add to your collection. I know 1970s watches are real hit or miss when it comes to consumers. People either like them or hate them. There's nothing really in between. And I think that has created a really unique kind of segment within the watch industry. So sucks that the Quartz Crisis happened, but I have to take my hat off to Seiko and the Quartz Crisis for allowing the watch industry to shrink to what's important and to make these watch companies a little bit more innovative. Right now, I think we're kind of in that expansion period, and we're going to hit a point where we need, you know, a massive shrink to occur. I think I was listening to an interview, and I think there's something like a little over 1,000 watch companies, which is not necessary. I think perhaps we need another crisis to come through, so that we can have that shrinking and perhaps a little bit more innovation occur. So if you like this video, let me know what you think about the Quartz Crisis. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Would love to hear your thoughts. And on that note, I hope you guys have a nice rest of your day.